Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Keep It Clean 2025 Product Advisory Webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Heidi Dancho, the Director of Communications at the Canola Council of Canada here in Winnipeg, and I'll be moderating today's session. As an export-driven industry, the success of Canadian agriculture depends on steady and predictable access to major international markets. And that's why we're here today. Crop production product application decisions are an important part of that. The Keep It Clean Product Advisory is an excellent tool to help guide growers, agronomists, and agri-retailers, and we trust that you'll find value in today's session. So before we get started, I'll just quickly review the Zoom webinar system and explain how to participate in today's event. So on your screen, you're going to see a chat tab and a Q&A tab. So please use the chat tab for just general hellos, general comments if you're having any technical difficulties during the webinar. And then if you have any questions, please submit those through the Q&A tab. We'll have some time to respond to questions at the end of the webinar, but please submit your questions as we go. And if we don't have time to get to your question during the Q&A portion, we'll follow up with you via email. And you can also feel free to reach out to us anytime at info@keepitclean.ca. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and a recording of today's session will be emailed out to all participants and posted on keepitclean.ca. So we have a lot to cover this morning, so we'll get started. Next slide, please. Yeah, so today we have 3 speakers with us to provide timely information about which crop protection products may create market risk in 2025 and how the Canadian grain industry is working together to mitigate those risks. I'd like to welcome Jeff English, Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Pulse Canada, who will review the crop and product combinations that may cause market risk for pulses. Krista Zuzak, who's the Director of Crop Protection and Production for Cereals Canada, who will review the crop and product combinations that may cause market risk for cereals, and Ian Epp, Agronomy Specialist at the Canola Council of Canada, who will provide an update for canola, along with some important tips on following the label when applying crop protection products this season. I will pass it over to Krista and Jeff to start us off with reviewing the importance of these practices and the process to determine market risk. Over to you, Krista.
Thanks, Heidi. Let's get the next slide, please. Thank you. So maybe to set the stage for today's webinar, I really just want to emphasize the importance of, exports for Canadian agriculture and really thinking about, how much of these commodities we're exporting. So, more than 90% of our canola, more than 80% of our wheat, and more than 85% of our pulses are exported. So this makes it really important for us to be able to meet not only domestic requirements, but also our export requirements. Next slide, please. So thinking about that, our grain does need to meet these requirements. Canada's exports meet the needs of our customers, but those export market requirements may be different than our Canadian regulations or Canadian requirements. An example of this is also our sanitary and phytosanitary requirements. So this may be something like weed seeds that may be prohibited, and these are also constantly changing in export markets, so there is a lot to monitor here. Another one of the challenges we see are MRLs, or maximum residue limit policies, in export markets may be inconsistent. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today, as well as some of the mitigation measures that we use to try to tackle that. Additional challenges we see are also, we like our decisions to be based on science, for example. However, we often see political pressures or commercial pressures or consumer preferences, for example, towards pesticide-free grains or products produced. And finally, we'll talk a little bit more about it today, but an increased frequency and sensitivity of testing. So whether this is for pesticide residues or for contaminants in harvested grain, we are seeing more strict requirements around that. Next slide. So I mentioned an MRL, or a maximum residue limit, but I think it's best to take a step back and explain what an MRL is. So an MRL, it's the highest amount of pesticide residue that we expect to remain in food or on grains, for example, when a pesticide is used according to label directions. So MRLs are legal and enforceable based on how pesticides are used. However, it's important to distinguish that often what we see in the media around pesticides like glyphosate might be links to food safety. MRLs, however, are not a measure of food safety. Food safety is considered in these risk assessments, but MRLs are really there for trade purposes. Often MRLs are set hundreds or even sometimes lower, thousands of times lower than what would be considered food safe on grains or on food products. And additionally, just to emphasize, we do have that challenge where, Canadian crops need to meet our MRLs set by destination countries to be avoiding trade disruptions. Next slide. So when we think about MRL policies in export markets, I mentioned that they can be inconsistent. So maybe to give a bit of an example of that, on the right side of your screen, you'll see we have a chart that's set up to explain a few of our major trading partner countries and what their MRL systems look like. So we'll refer to something as a deferral pathway. So what that is, some of our export markets might have a deferral pathway. So if they're not setting their own MRLs through a national list, they might defer to another country, for example, if they have missing or misaligned MRLs. Canada, for example, we set our own national MRL list, and these MRLs are set by Health Canada. We don't have a deferral pathway, so if in Canada we're missing some MRLs, we don't defer to another country, and then we have a default MRL in place that if we do not have an MRL, it would be set at 0.1 parts per million. We see other trading partners like the European Union, where they also don't have a deferral pathway, but perhaps their default MRL is lower, set at 0.01. Or interestingly, we might see countries like or areas like Paraguay where they have a national MRL list, but where MRLs are missing, they would defer to Codex, which is the international standard setting body that conducts risk assessments for MRLs, and then the EU. So, when we talk about, for example, the EU reducing or removing some MRLs, it also impacts other countries or regions that might be deferring to the EU. All this to say that when we look at a lack of MRL deferral pathways, for example, this can lead to a greater chance of MRL non-compliance. We also see, and we're going to talk about some policies today, that we have more countries that are establishing or amending their national MRL list, like South Korea, for example, that had some temporary MRLs in place that they're looking to firm up. Next slide. Also, our export markets change. So they're ever changing and they can be impacted by multiple factors, including geopolitical circumstances. So our national commodity organizations, including those that are on the line today with canola and pulse and cereals, are always monitoring for these changes. So thinking about all of the countries that our grains go to and how export dependent we are, there's a lot of factors to be considering and wanting to be up to date on those markets. As well, I think now more than ever, we recognize the importance of having market diversity as a trade strategy. So with that, when we look at each commodity, we also make considerations on that annual basis for existing markets, but also those market changes. So a lot of us are looking at kind of the standard setters for MRL. So that would be international like Codex, the US, the EU, because a lot of those deferral pathways, or Japan. But we also think about those that are significant to the value chain. So these would be our major export destinations based on dollars in trade value, or the percent of grain that are going to those countries, as well as thinking about markets that are undergoing policy change, like I alluded to with South Korea, or in China where they're establishing more MRLs. Next slide, please. And just to touch on one more specific example with the European Union. So what we're seeing there is an increase in some of these MRL changes that I alluded to. So as part of their SPS agreement, the EU has actually been submitting more notifications. So they had almost a 20% increase between 2023 and 2024. Canada, and when we rank them, is 10th place. So they had 73 notifications versus the EU had 147 notifications of these changes around maximum residue limits, for example. As well, worth noting that they're not just for pesticides. So actually the most notices in the EU were around feed additives, but pesticides were second place. And finally, for the European Union, it's also important to note that these kind of notifications often do have consultation periods or, where we can provide comments on these. So when we see those coming out of trade partners, actually Canada is one of the most active commenters on EU legislation. Next slide, please. And also with the European Union, they've recently published in February of this year their vision for agriculture and food. So this is based on the outcome of the strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture. So you might be familiar with the farm to fork strategy. This is one of their next visions that's been published. And so it still does contain continued language around mirror clauses. So what this would mean is, we would have pesticides that aren't approved or banned in the EU. And if, Canadian producers are relying on those or wanting to use those, they could reach trade barriers by wanting to ship that grain to the EU. So essentially what would be is it would cause potential restrictions on being able to use those pesticides here in Canada because trade to the EU will not accept them. Next slide. So when we think about all of those challenges and how, as an industry, we go about trying to manage this risk of MRL-related trade disruption, for the short term, we really want to try to reduce that immediate level of trade risk. So this would be those annual reviews of the risk of pesticides by our commodity associations. This would be communication through the Keep It Clean program, like what we're here for today. And then also looking through kind of the medium and longer term. So the medium term work may be things like where we see missing MRLs, working with the product registrants and life science companies to get those established in major markets to ensure we have less friction on trade. And also on the longer term. So this is where we really focus on working together with multiple commodities or multi-country efforts, perhaps, to try to advocate for harmonization of MRLs through codex, regulatory cooperation, or we may see these showing up in trade agreements. Next slide, please. Also worth mentioning, when we think about Canadian grain moving from farm to export, it moves in many pathways. And as well, this increases the complexity for residue testing because this can also occur at many different points along the supply chain, so both domestically and upon export. And I think maybe the biggest takeaway from this we can have is to assume that grain will be tested within the supply chain, and they'll be looking for those residues that we're concerned about and why we're here today. Next slide. So conversely, we've talked about the industry role, but also thinking about the role that growers can play. I think, again, one of the complexities there is that MRLs are not on product labels. So, we're used to thinking about products or pesticides that may be registered in Canada on a particular crop. But some of these information on market risks, don't always have a way to be communicated. So that's, again, why we have programs like Keep It Clean. But the advice there, and I know Ian is going to talk more about this, and Jeff is also going to talk about this today, really the importance of adhering to those product labels. So the rate, the timing, and the PHI to try to keep those MRLs in check. And then also thinking about, your product type, your application timing, and crop type, and how that also might influence the residues that we're seeing from pesticides. And then again, just to reiterate that we do see the international landscape changing from a trade perspective, from a testing perspective. So really emphasizing the importance of having those conversations. So with our National Commodity Association for the crops that you grow, but also having those conversations with your grain buyer. Next slide. And from here, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff with Pulse Canada to talk more about our Keep It Clean program.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Krista, and good morning, everybody, and good afternoon if you're out east. Nice to see such a large participation for something like this, so it's great to see so many people engaged. I'll touch a little bit on the Keep It Clean program. For those of you familiar with it, will know it's a joint initiative between the Canola Council of Canada, Cereals Canada, ourselves here at Pulse, as well as the Prairie Oak growers. And it really is about arming growers with the tools they need, the information they need to ensure that the crops they're producing are going to be able to be accepted by export markets around the world. And so, our groups invest and we take that money and apply for government programming as well and partner with the Government of Canada to try to get that message out as clearly and consistently to those who need it to ensure that export markets for Canadian crops remain open. Go to the next slide. As I mentioned, when we have a campaign around various things throughout the year, like this product advisory webinar, like some pre-harvest messaging that would go out. But it really centers around elevating the importance of talking to a grain buyer, of knowing what you're applying and when you're applying it from a grower perspective, and knowing that your product you're producing will be acceptable to different end markets. As Krista just touched on, different countries have different requirements with respect to what they're testing for, what they deem acceptable. And so it's really about empowering everybody with the knowledge to know that the crops they're putting in, that they're not limiting where their crop may be able to go, and certainly not putting at risk any markets that would be testing for certain things that we wouldn't want to be applied. If you go to the next slide, I think the Keep It Clean initiative is a great example of collaboration between commodity associations, value chain associations like ours. We have a market acceptance of pesticide use policy that the industry has come together on. The reasons for this are many, but it's really about the reliable access as listed there to foreign export markets to make sure that Canadian crops can continue to go around the world. This group is kind of governed by a steering committee. There's a seat for everybody throughout the value chain, including commodity associations, grower representation, exporters, grain handlers, life science companies, retailers, to ensure that we have a good handle, whether it's on cereal crops, pulse crops, canola, of what the market is telling us, and that we're communicating that information back through the value chain to growers every year, because things can change year on year. If you go to the next slide, kind of what that looks like on paper is how we come together and make these assessments and kind of produce the document that we'll be touching on. The product advisory is really that, like from right from the farm gate back to the export to the end user approach. So you can see everybody in the value chain sitting around a table discussing what they're hearing, talking about what's reasonable, and certainly talking about what the different policies of different important markets are, to come together to drive at the document we're going to touch on. If you go to the next slide. What do we look at? So there's three key components in terms of how we will define the level of risk. Is perhaps not an exact science, but certainly once these are followed, we can feel very confident in the information that we're communicating out to growers about the products that they'll be using, and whether or not they're putting anything in jeopardy. So certainly the markets of interest, and I know Krista touched on a few of them. What are the countries to worry about? What are the policies that they have? What are driving, and what's on the horizon? So certainly paying great attention to places like the European Union, who have kind of been leading the charge, we'll say, in terms of restricting access and restricting what may or may not be accepted, knowing that we have that information and communicating it back. Has anything changed with respect to registrations of different crop protection products or pesticides? Are we finding new residues in certain testing? Are they getting to a threshold where they could be deemed a problem by one of these export markets? Is something that's looked at. And then how important is the market, and how close are we coming up to those types of issues? Is it a big problem? Would it significantly impact Canada's ability to export? Obviously keeping markets open is a priority for all of us here on this call, and I know for all of you on the line. And so we want to just, making sure that we're having an honest conversation as an industry into what level of risk we're actually putting ourselves at by improper use, or by using things that may pose a risk depending on the market. If you head to the next slide, kind of a top-down approach, we'll say, with respect to how we go about it as a group, and led through kind of the Canada Grains Council policy guide there. I won't belabor this, but just to know that there's a bit of a step-by-step process that the group will follow when it comes to new products or products that may be emerging as a concern. Really just to talk about, are we doing our diligence? Are we treating every instance, with the utmost cause and concern? Because we know that just one tow out of line, one shipment rejected can have real world and devastating market implications for us as an exporting nation. Head to the next slide, just to touch on a little bit of like what are our acceptability of risk And how do we arrive there? You can see with respect to residues and things that would be considered the shipping and handling, and from a pulse side of things, we are less likely on the pulse side to use bulk vessels than say our the other crops. So percentage shipped in containers is things that we're looking at with respect to what are the odds of blending or being put together at elevators. And then end use requirements. So really it comes down to, at a buyer to buyer level, I would say these days, you can get pretty specific, and buyers are getting pretty specific into what they're looking for, and we want them to know that when it comes from Canada, that it's shipped and it's purchased with confidence that they're getting what they asked for. And so, the tips and tools that we'll go through on this call help ensure that end use quality. If you go to the next slide, there's 3 categories that we'll touch on for the product advisory. You can read them there in front of you. They are pretty straightforward from a do not use. There's several different ways that you could land that a product can land on that categorization, but it really comes down to use of this product is going to put the market at risk. With respect to the be informed category, there are certain markets that are more stringent than others, and so you do see this exclamation point quite a bit throughout the document, and it really comes down to talking to a grain buyer to ensure that the markets they're selling into, your crop is going to be acceptable to them to be purchased. The last thing you want to happen is, yes, reading and following the label, having done everything right, and then finding out, the export market actually dictates something a little bit different. If that conversation can happen up front, it can save a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of headaches. And then no recommendation, so a green check mark kind of, at least in terms of as long as you're reading and following the label, it will not cause a market issue. We typically don't list all the products like this because it's more of an advisory type document, but there are certain things as MRLs get established and things like that where we will communicate out, no risk of using, just to make sure that if there have been issues in the past and there no longer are, that information hits growers. Head to the next slide. So the 2025 advisory is out. It's categorized online, and you can kind of click through to see the crops and the applications that are most important or most relevant to your own individual operation. We do it by crop type at the top there, just to kind of for a farmer who's looking for information quickly. It's important for us. We used to create a physical guide even as well, and kind of go over it. It's a digital era right now, and so we want farmers to have access to this information where they need it at their fingertips on their smartphones. So we're always looking for feedback on this. So if you play around with it and you have some ideas, then please let us know. But that's what the advisory is going to look like for 2025. If you take to the next slide here. We have a new feature in summarizing of categorization, so it will allow you to view all advisories on fungicides, growth regulators, pre-harvest weed control, and desiccants at a glance. So it's kind of a new feature of 2025, and something I think that we feel is going to be of great value. And on the next slide, you can see that the guide will allow for viewing by active ingredients as well. So we feel a pretty in-depth tool. There's a lot of information in there. Work starts very early on in the year from those recommending committees, as we touched on, to our leads here at our individual organizations, to make sure that the information is accurate and it's double and triple checked, so that we're communicating out at times like this, that the growers can feel very confident in the information, and then of course that they're actively talking with their grain buyers to ensure that the information is double, triple checked on their end as well. So with that, I'll flip it back to Krista, who's going to touch on the product advisory for cereals for 2025.
Thanks, Jeff. If I get the next slide, please. I just want to start by mentioning that we don't have any new advisories on cereals for 2025. So these are the same advisories that have been in place for 2024 and some of them longer than that. So I'm going to go through them by crop, starting with barley, and then maybe just a bit of a call to action at the end. So when we look at our advisories, we do separate barley for food and feed and barley for malt. So first to start with food and feed. We have two fungicides on this screen. The first one is fluopyram. So for this one, we do have it as an amber or a be informed or kind of use that caution. And this is due to the MRLs that you'll see on the bottom of your screen. So we have, we're missing the MRL for China, for example, but also the low MRL in Japan that's set at 0.01 parts per million that can cause some market risk. Additionally, we also have tetraconazole. Tetraconazole is missing the MRL in China as well as the Codex MRL for barley. So for this, we do have it as a red advisory or do not use. Often if we're missing a China MRL, they often do defer to Codex, but in this instance with both of them missing, that's where we've identified that market risk. Next slide. As well for barley, for food and feed, we have a plant growth regulator on there, which is chlormequat. So this is due to misaligned MRLs in some of our major markets. As a result of that, there are some markets that don't pose a market risk. So we have it as an amber or be informed. So this is one of those instances where if you're wanting to use chlormequat on your barley, you want to be having those conversations with your grain buyers to confirm that they're accepting it for where that barley might be moving. And then finally on barley for food and feed, we have glyphosate, really for glyphosate, and you're going to see this messaging continue for malt barley, for wheat, as well as for oats. The biggest message for glyphosate on cereals is to be not using it as a desiccant. So again, to follow the label and be using it for its intended use as a pre-harvest weed control agent. This is really there to prevent those unacceptable residues in harvested grain that we might see, and we'll have some tools on our website around that as well to make sure we're targeting that appropriate moisture level. So again, this one's an amber, so the importance of having those conversations with your grain buyer. Next slide. For malt barley and cereals, this is actually where we see most of our advisories. This has also to do with the fact that with malt barley, contracts and specifications are very important, but malt barley is mainly containerized. So Jeff touched upon the policy and where, we might see bulk handled grain like wheat has kind of that dilution factor for residues. We just don't see that happening the same way in containerized shipments like malt barley. So again, we have the fungicides fluopyram and tetraconazole, but for malt barley, they are red or do not use either of those on your malt barley for the same reasons. Next slide. As well on malt barley, we have chlormequat. So again, due to those misaligned MRLs, so the importance of having that conversation with your grain buyer. And the difference also we see on malt barley is for glyphosate, it's a red or a do not use. So we don't want to see the use of glyphosate due to some market acceptance issues. And as well, for malt barley, we have saflufenicil. So also falling under that pre-harvest weed control category, saflufenicil on malt barley specifically is also a red, or do not use. I put up the MRLs for saflufenicil on the screen. So you'll see, even though we have some different alignments, this is mainly due to a market acceptance issue due to malt quality concerns. Next slide, please. For wheat, we only have glyphosate on the advisories for wheat currently. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really around the proper use of this. So it's an amber or be informed. So having those conversations with your grain buyers to ensure that your grain will be accepted if it's treated with glyphosate, depending on the market. But again, really keeping in mind about the proper use of that product. Next slide, please. And finally, for oats, the only active advisory we have on oats is for glyphosate. So we're looking at the same. It's an amber, have those conversations with your grain buyer. And again, really driving home the importance of, follow the label when you're using glyphosate on products like oats. Next slide, please. And finally, it's not a difference on the advisory, but the only addition I've made for 2025 is just we really want to, drive home the importance of thinking about, follow the label when it comes to desiccants. So when we have desiccants like glufosinate or diquat, these are not registered for use on cereals. So these can cause market access issues. One of the reasons desiccants in particular can cause some additional issues with residues is because this later application timing, can cause concerns with residues, and these are paired with either low or missing MRLs because they're not intended to be used on cereals. So this growing season, when you're thinking about the use of registered desiccants, just keep in mind that some of those off-label uses like glufosinate or diquat that might be registered on other crops are not acceptable on cereals. Next slide, please. And with that, I will pass it back over to you, Jeff, to go through the pulse advisories.
All right, thanks, Krista. And if we go to the next slide, kind of a summary of what might be new and different this year for 2025. Two kind of major changes that I would point out. One is on flunicimid on green lentils, and we'll get to that and what it means, as well as just a further clarification around glufosinate ammonium and its that it is not approved for use on chickpea, dry beans, fava beans in Western Canada, and should not be used. So we'll touch on that as we go here. On the next slide, if we go crop by crop. For dry beans, so glyphosate, you'll again find this year a be informed market exception notation to indicate acceptance issues. Most dry bean dealers, specifically in Eastern Canada, do not allow glyphosate on dry beans, and that comes from who the markets they're selling into and agreed for the customers. So it's well communicated and well known, but again, we would highlight that. With respect to glufosinate ammonium, you can see there that for Eastern Canada, it is registered and can be used on certain market classes that are exported into Japan. The basic assumption should be that it is not accepted. So that would be a very specific instance, and again, would encourage growers to speak directly with their buyers to ensure that they're not doing anything that would put that crop at risk. In Western Canada, it is not registered for use, so it is do not use. If we move on to the next slide on chickpeas, again, you'll find a market acceptance notation with respect to glyphosate. Again, just around market acceptance issues into some major markets. The use of pre-harvest glyphosate, as you can see there, is restricted on some crops by certain grain buyers. So again, that conversation being very important. Glufosinate ammonium is being very clearly outlined as do not use. It is not registered for use on chickpeas, and any crop with residues treated with glufosinate will not be accepted. If you go into the next slide on faba beans, so same song and dance with respect to market acceptance of glyphosate, being important to have that conversation. And glufosinate ammonium, again, you'll see the same. It's not registered for use on faba beans. It will not be accepted. It is not to be used. Moving on to lentils. So I talked about flunicimid. There we go. Next slide. Perfect. With respect to flunicimid on green lentils, so there is some uncertainty on the MRL in the European Union market with respect to green lentils. Pulse Canada has been working very closely with the registrant, with the distributor, to address the uncertainty around this growing season. It is possible that grain buyers may not accept grain treated with this, and so that's where that conversation becomes very important. So that is a change from last year. You can see the be aware category, be informed, and so it's an important message that we like to get out there, specific to green lentils, specifically going into that European market. But it's important enough that we have made that categorization. With respect to glyphosate, again, market acceptance notation to indicate when a classification is made for market risk rather than MRL concerns, and that's what you find there. And on glufosinate ammonium, it is do not use. There are no MRLs established in export markets, and grain buyers will not be accepting lentils treated with glufosinate. Move on to, last but not least, to peas on the next slide. Again, glyphosate market acceptance notation around acceptability of that into certain major markets. So always talk with your grain buyer and be sure of what you're putting on your crop there. Around glufosinate ammonium, to hammer the point home again, it is not registered for use on peas. Grain buyers will not accept it. So it should not be used. And so we're calling specific attention to that as well, just to ensure that the awareness is out there within the industry. That covers the changes off on pulses, and I think with that, I will flip it over to Ian, who's going to make his first appearance and talk to the canola side of things. So over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Jeff. Morning, everyone. Talking about canola, we'll just jump right into the next slide. So in canola, we are again fortunate this year to have no markets of concern for on canola. So we don't have any specific concerns. If we follow the label, and I guess I'll talk about that and a few other things yet, we should have no concerns. Any product that's registered on canola, you can use as per the label. The one thing I will note is just malathion. This is not the use on canola but for treating bins. This has been a long staple thing that if you're gonna treat your bins, we recommend you don't use malathion, and definitely you cannot use malathion on bins that are going to be destined for canola. So if you're treating your bins pre-harvest or getting them ready this summer, don't use any malathion on bins that are for canola. We have no, there's no, if there can be residues, and we don't have market set up for that. So just that's one of those watch outs. It's been on the radar for a long time. Nothing new there. So again, in canola, we have no markets of concern for products registered for use on canola, which is the same as last year. Next slide. I thought we'd give a bit of an update on Lambda. So we've had this Lambda problem where certain use patterns were restricted, and there was this food versus feed market, and how do we process this as an industry, and it created some confusion. The resolution of that is as of February of this year, the feed restrictions or the feed is back on for Lambda, so including oils, pulses, cereal grains, it's acceptable. So essentially, just looking at your label, you can go back to following the old label or more business as usual for us in Western Canada. So just something there has been in. There was a lot of confusion around it. It was a confusing one to kind of process, but for this year, we're kind of back to using Lambda, I guess, as per usual or as needed. Next slide. So talking about this, so again, in canola, we don't have anything on our product label, but for all of the crops, all of the work we do and the residues, the expected residues are based on the fact that we're going to follow the label, whatever the label is, and we have to stay on that. So there's three things to talk about when we're talking about staying on the label. The first is the rate. Second, timing, so when we can apply it as far as crop staging, and then that pre-harvest interval, the days between spraying and cutting your crop. So these are really critical components of staying on label that you apply your product, or if you even apply a product that's registered, but you apply it outside of one of these three things, we might still have a residue issue that causes problems. Next slide. So timing, glyphosate is probably the most important one. All of them have timing components, but glyphosate is really, really important when it comes to pre-harvest weed control. You're applying it for pre-harvest weed control once your grain moisture is less than 30%. That's kind of across all of the crops. What that looks like is a little bit different. If you want specific staging guides or reminder of what that looks like in canola versus pulses, keep it clean. We have those staging guides to kind of walk you through. This is what 30% looks like. This is really key. Applications that are made too early, we see residues in all of these crops. That unacceptable residues. We see them. They're testable, and they can cause some agronomic problems too, right? We don't want to be applying this product too early. We got to get this timing really important. So for all products, timing is important, but specifically glyphosate, really challenging some years when you have crops that are all over the map as far as staging, but important to get the timing right. Next slide. The other thing I'll mention, so getting the most out of your application, we talk about on the Keep It Clean about the latest you can apply or staying on the label. Agronomically, though, there's a lot of incentive maybe to apply earlier, even though you can apply. So this is a canola example, but you can apply some of these products up into bolting. And maybe there's times when that's a required application or that's a good decision. But the earlier we can apply them from an agronomic perspective, the better weed control we're going to get, the easier it is on the crop, generally speaking. We're going to get more bushels out of that way. Those are the critical period of weed control is earlier. And then if we do need in canola maybe, or in some options where you have an option of a second herbicide pass, you can get that second herbicide pass on and maybe the 5-leaf stage or early bolting, still on label and not pushing the envelope up to that really late window where is part of the crop, the more advanced areas, is it even past the window or are we kind of just really on the line? So just highlighting here, we talk about the staying on the label, which is critical. But agronomically, if we start those herbicide applications a little bit earlier, agronomically it makes a lot of sense. We're probably those early weeds are the ones that are robbing yield from us, robbing moisture, fertility, causing us more grief. And then it gives us a little bit more flexibility if we herbicide decisions or pesticide decisions in general get delayed a little bit. Just an important thing to highlight there. Next slide. So reading and follow the label. So pre-harvest intervals, they can vary greatly between products, even somewhat similar products. I like to use insecticides as the example of this. Maybe you're looking to for a late season insecticide for a grasshopper or for some other product. There's 5 or 6 products maybe on the market that will all do very similar things, maybe different active ingredients, but the actual results at the end of the day is they'll be effective on a late season insect. They might have pre-harvest intervals that range from maybe a day to 7 days to 30 days. Those are real examples of pre-harvest intervals. So especially as we get into the back half of the season, or if you're making a pesticide application that's new to you, one that you don't normally make, hopefully a late season insect that maybe we haven't seen in 5 or 10 years or something like that, just be aware that even though products are registered to on that insect, there's a big difference in pre-harvest intervals, and depending on how close we are to harvest, there might only be, even though there's 5 registered, there might only 1 or 2 that have a pre-harvest interval that works with your harvesting timing. You can go to the Keep It Clean website. We have a calculator that will allow you to calculate by crop, by pest, by active ingredient, which is the best fit for you. Just quick and easy to make sure you are making the right application. Next slide. Drones. This is something else that we've added in this year. So we all know drone tech is advancing really quickly. The key, I guess, high level, first thing we need to remember is that it cannot be used to apply pesticides for field crops in Canada. We don't have registration for that. Even though the tech may be there, there's a lot of drones out there. We don't have registration on the label. So when we talk about following the label, drones are off the label right now. The PMRA is working on a pathway to bring them on label and looking at what that is. There's lots of steps. There's a lot of work in progress there. It would be nice if it was moving along a little faster. For this growing season, no pesticides can be applied by drone. Unfortunately, that's just where we are right now. Even if a pesticide label has an aerial application on it, that's different than a drone. So just to be aware that these are putting you off label if you're using a drone, right? This is an off-label use pattern, can pose market risk, residues that may be unacceptable. When you go to harvest your grain, you're signing a declaration that says you're on label. And again, this would be one way in which you could be off label. Hopefully that we can resolve that sooner rather than later and we can use drones. But for right now, for this growing season, this is where we are, just on the regulatory side of things. Next slide. I'll turn it back over to Heidi for the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Ian. Okay, we have a few minutes here to answer any questions from the group. I'll just start with a few here. First one is, how big of a problem is it where producers don't adhere to labels and regulations? I don't know from our group if we have anyone who wants to volunteer to address that one. Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into specifics, I think not a large one, but only one instance can be large, if that's the right way to say it. Like, we know the overwhelming majority of producers read and follow the label. They're acting responsibly. It's in their best economic interest, and that's just who they are. This isn't about discouraging things like off-label or assuming that this problem is happening. It's mostly just about ensuring that people have the most up-to-date information so that they're not doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And so that's more the nature, Harry, of the issue. It's not a massive widespread problem whatsoever. We just want to create as little chance as possible that any kind of off-label use might be happening and be putting export markets at risk.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Anyone want to add anything there? You're good? Okay, great. Next question here. Are there any MRLs on the horizon for biologicals and organics? I'm not sure if anyone wants to chime in on that one. Ian?
I can take a quick.
Sure.
So we've had those discussions, I think, or at least I've had those discussions with the Canola Market Access Committee. There is certainly interest in How do these products work? Is there a need for an MRL? Um, and maybe that is something that will come down the pipe. In the meantime, right now, really the one of the biggest focuses on establishing the MRL is market stability and trade export. And is there a residue, a detectable residue, and is that of a concern? A lot of the biologicals, we don't see residues. So if we don't have a residue, it makes it a lot lower risk that it could become a trade issue or something that we need to then have an extra regulatory requirement or some sort of limit on. So that could be possible. Their biologicals is a very fast-moving paced kind of segment. So it's possible that we could have something that does have residues and maybe we do need MRLs. But in the meantime, or until that time, we don't have any right now, or we don't have much right now, but certainly something that we're actively following.
Great, thanks, Ian. A couple questions here on drones. How does the risk of unacceptable residue levels potentially differ between traditional aerial spraying and drone application? Krista, are you able to take this one?
Sure, thanks, Heidi. I think again, it's an interesting space, and as Ian mentioned, it's something that I think people are eager to be early adopters of technology, but something we need to balance. And I think maybe the biggest difference is when we look at our aerial application for pesticides, we have established rates, and really because these are based on data sets. And I think that's one of the biggest parts that we're missing for drones to be able to move forward is we need to establish those data sets. We need to understand rates, and those rates go hand in hand with, not only understanding the efficacy of those products, but also the residues that may be produced. So I think those are some of the biggest differences we might see there. And just right now that we don't have that predictability of the residues that drones might be causing. But there is work happening on that. So maybe also important to mention there is an OECD working group on drones and pesticides, and they are working to be able to build those data sets that will help, regulators and registrants, work together as a value chain on this issue.
Great, thanks, Krista. And just kind of a related question, just to clarify, is the drone issue for all crops or just canola? So I'll just let you clarify that.
Sure. So that one would be across the board. So currently in Canada, we don't have any pesticides that are registered for any of the crop types, and we don't have any registered pesticides for drone application on their labels right now.
Great, thanks, Krista. Another question here. Any MRL issues with etheryl PGR active is ethofon? Not sure which crop type that'll go to you, Krista.
I can start that one off.
Okay.
So I know there are multiple registrations for that pesticide, and it's something we have seen come up recently. I believe there was an MRL change in the EU in particular that did cause some concerns around that. So it is something we're monitoring. Again, with the timing of an application of a PGR. So we don't have a current advisory on it, but it is something that we're monitoring as we see those MRL changes happening and working along with the registrants on what the residues might look like, what markets the crops are going into, and other factors like that.
Great, thanks, Krista. This one I think is just to clarify. I know you in some of your slides you showed some of the MRLs, and I think it was just a question to clarify that those were amounts in parts per million. I don't know if you wanted to address that one.
Sure, thanks, Heidi, and a good catch and something we will definitely get corrected for next year. All of the charts and the slides for each of the crop types do have those MRL numbers on them. Those are all in parts per million, but that is important to understand because at times we do have contaminant levels that can be in parts per billion, but we'll be sure to catch that for next year and include that in our tables.
Great, thanks, Krista. Yeah, if there's any more questions, please get those into the Q&A box. Just one here, what do you suggest are the 3 key takeaways? Maybe I can pass that through to each of our participants and we can close with that one. Ian, did you want to start with that one?
3 key takeaways. If in doubt, I mean, we're at the beginning of the growing season right now, right? Maybe you've bought some products, but we're kind of at all options on the table now. Now is a great time to take a little bit of time and kind of set yourself what applications do I think I might need, and double check, keep a clean website, check your crop protection guides, make sure I'm updated with the labels. Something you used last year Maybe there's a label registration that's changed. Not a big issue, but maybe it's a little bit different this year. So familiarizing yourselves with the labels or having that easy access, getting yourself set up so that when you do go to make an application, whether it's buying the product or in the sprayer, it's ready to go and you have that information so that follow the label. A lot of the stuff we talked about today, it's key stuff, but it doesn't change that much. Maybe a little bit of information change. So having that information accessible throughout the growing season, that's probably number one. Number two is just giving yourself options. So whether it's applying our herbicide on the early side, make sure we're not right at the edge of the window. Sometimes crops get stagey, so giving yourself some options for those herbicide app or pesticide applications so that we're not backed into a corner where we don't have a pesticide that's we can't use a pesticide that we really would need to use or would like to use. Um, I didn't prepare my top three. My third one is just glyphosate is a critical to what we do. It's the most used product for all of these crops. So the timing on that one, if you're going to pick one product to really make sure we dial in, we're using it correctly by the label. Let's get our glyphosate applications dialed in this season.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Krista, did you want to add to that?
Sure. So I think I'll piggyback on Ian's about glyphosate, and I think that's one of the biggest ones we want to think about. And really, it's thinking about, following the label, but also just, the responsible use of these tools not only helps with market access, but also helps preserve having those tools, right? And avoiding having, any additional restrictions or anything more severe about pesticides that growers really do rely on. And maybe just one other to mention before we pass it over to Jeff. I would say ask those questions and have those conversations. So whether it's with, the commodity associations that you see here, we're all more than happy to answer your questions and to help out wherever we can, but also to have those conversations with your grain buyers, because we don't want anyone being surprised when they go to deliver their grain at the elevator, whether by what's on the declaration or, having a shipment that isn't accepted because of a crop protection product you've used.
Great. Thanks, Krista. And over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, I think my colleagues did a great job touching on what's important. From a pulse perspective, we're really focused on getting that message around glufosinate ammonium out there, that it's not to be used on pulse crops, and that's you're gonna hear a lot from us with respect to that over the coming weeks and months. Touched on some of the changes, but I think Krista nailed it. Like, this is about market access, and I think if you're paying attention in the world right now, trading markets are as important as they've ever been for this country. So ensuring that we're all doing our respective jobs to ensure the markets remain open and that Canada can continue to export and grow exports and expand even beyond traditional markets is important. And it starts on the farm, and the tips are there. If there's any questions, absolutely any one of our organizations or connecting with that grain buyer is essential. And this is a really important file for us collectively as an industry, and so there's no such thing as a bad question. Please fire them off, and we're happy to help navigate the marketplace out there for you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, that looks like everything for today. So just a few final notes. As you exit, please complete the Zoom feedback survey that'll pop up on your screen. We really appreciate your comments to help inform our future webinars. As a reminder, we will be emailing out a link with the webinar recording and a reminder to fill out the feedback survey in a few days. You're welcome to share the recording, encouraged to share that recording and any of the Keep It Clean resources with your networks. Another quick heads up. Keep It Clean will be hosting another webinar later this summer. That one will be focused on the pre-harvest tips and tools. So I hope everyone here can join us for that as well. And finally, for those of you interested in getting your CEUs for participating in today's webinar, we will be submitting a list of the CCAs who attended today's live webinar, along with the CCA numbers we collected at registration. If you happen to miss providing your CCA number, please just email us at info@keepitclean.ca, and we will be sure to add you to the list. And then on behalf of Keep It Clean, I would just like to thank everyone again for joining today's event, and a big thank you to our speakers for participating today. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks again.